We're going to do two things to kick off. First, I'm going to introduce a little bit of who Irrational Labs is, just so folks get the context. We've met a lot of you and we haven't met many of you. And then we'll talk about, I'll do a quick intro to Jen that talks about why this is very interesting to behavioral science as a field, and that I'm personally very interested in it. So buckle up. And if you have not, please do post where you're calling in from. We'd love to kind of hear what time it is for you and where you're calling in from. So we'll start with just who Irrational Labs is. So basically, we're a behavioral science group. It was started by myself and Dan Ariely over 10 years ago now. We founded the behavioral science group at Google. Over the years, we've worked with hundreds of these companies, from Apple to Microsoft, LinkedIn, Indeed, Intuit, to drive behavior change. And so what we're doing is using the science of behavior change to infuse behavior change within these companies. And as Jen would like to say, or I like the phrase from the book, making things work for people. Make it so that a person could actually use a thing. And I think that's what our team at Irrational Labs tries to do. We do it for products and marketing teams. We also do trainings. We're kicking off a AI and BI strategy sprint. And generally, this is in the product. If you're someone looking for consulting, these are the types of things we do. And in behavioral science, we tend to say we are good at getting people to do something. And usually that means acquisition and engagement. It means 0 to 1, creating products or features when the canvas is blank. And we also do general holistic reviews of product strategy. At the core of that is figuring out how to help people do the thing that they want to do. The easiest way to get involved, if you're interested in that, is we have an 8-week online behavioral design bootcamp course. People really like it. It's a quick way to get interested and up to date on the field. And we also do membership. So basically, you'll get the course, you get this membership. It includes a Slack, and it's really what you're part of today. So basically, every month we do events. This is our open event. Excited to have everyone on the call. If you're a member, you also get other special events. We do kind of 3 other additional events a month, and then you get this very active Slack with folks asking and answering questions, kind of the latest in the behavioral science field. So if you're interested in this, you can go to irrationallabs.com or directly to the Behavioral Economics Bootcamp. Okay, so we've got who Irrational Labs is, and I'm going to introduce Jen. I think I got to know Jen, or know of Jen, when she was working and leading Code for America a very long time ago. She's been in this field for a very long time. She then went to the United States Digital Service, and then in COVID, founded that. In COVID, started something that Irrational Labs tried to help with a little bit with the United States Digital Response, and generally has a lot of at-bats trying to get stuff done in government. And so this is not typical for our typical events. Normally, we're interviewing behavioral scientists that are embedded within large companies and trying to figure out how they do what they do. The reality is Jen has been embedded in government and acting, I would say, as a mini behavioral scientist, trying to figure out how to do behavior change, not only internally within government, but for the end consumer as well. And I think one of the things that is most appealing here is that in behavioral science, we tend to say it's the system. And if you were to put any person in the system, they would behave as the system would dictate they would behave. So a classic example we like to give is, I like M&Ms, but if the M&Ms are far from me, I will eat them less than if they are close to me. I, as a person, have not changed. The system and the environment has changed. And what Jen has done is study basically the system of government to figure out how it works, why it works. And kind of the conclusion is the same, that any person, if put inside that system, would behave as if other people would behave. And when we say the system of government, we typically mean, or in Jen's book, really talks about norms, talks about incentives, talks about friction. And these are the small details of life that really get people to do or not do something. I'll add that one of the best moments I had or biggest surprise I had in my career was the first meeting I had with Dan Ariely. We were starting this Google's behavioral economics group. I thought we were going to be talking about strategy. We just met with some big teams. And we spent an hour on copy. Like, we were designing an intervention, and we agonized over the copy of what the intervention would be. And I think that's really about what behavioral science is that behavior changes in the details. And what Jen's going to talk about and has talked about in her book is some of these details. of behavior change. So with that, I would say number one, we're going to hear from Jen. If you have not bought the book, please do buy the book. Ryan, if you could post a link in the chat to the book. Ezra Klein interviewed Jen. I heard it. I also read the book, and I still feel like I want more. So this interview should not suffice on you understanding how the systems of government. I want to encourage you to dive in. Okay, with that spiel, Jen, maybe you could just kick off with an overview, bird's eye view of what the book is about, and then we can go into a few of those stories. Oh, and I think you're not, yeah.
Sorry about that. Still getting a handle on that. Thank you for the fantastic introduction, Kristen. I think that's exactly right. I didn't intend to sort of study how people behave in government, but that's sort of what happened. And of course, then how people behave in government creates systems that impact how people interact with government. And ultimately, sort of for the general public who's not going to be creating these services or trying to make them more usable, I'm trying to help people understand that this gap that we already know is there between what government says it's going to do and what it actually does comes from somewhere. I think people don't really recognize the gap. So I start out with some examples of that gap. We say we're going to clear criminal records, but then sort of nothing happens. You know, we're going to improve the quality of care in Medicare, and instead the laws that we pass to do that have sort of or threaten to have the opposite impact. We say we're going to give people more money at COVID, we do, but then some people get left out and we sort of miss it. So this behavior in government determines the systems that determine whether we meet our policy goals or not. And too often we are not. So I'm trying to sort of call that out and explain why that is happening. And I think that there is an enormous amount of frustration with government, how government is designed. And it's easy simply to be frustrated and wish government worked better. It is much more meaningful and interesting to understand why government gets those outcomes and figure out what you might actually do about it. So one of the reasons that I wrote the book is that I think a lot of people, and I'm sure a lot of people who have joined today, could think about ways that rather than just being upset with these outcomes and these frustrating interactions with government, we might actually be able to sort of dig in, help out, join government, work with government, all of these things. So maybe I'll just start with one of the stories that has caught the eye of a lot of people that speaks to, I think, the behaviors that we don't want to see, but often see in government. And that was a moment that I was working at I was working in the White House, trying to stand up the United States Digital Service. And I was trying to show how we would work in future interactions with agencies. So I got us an engagement with the Department of Veterans Affairs. They were having a problem where the Veterans Benefit Management System was running very slowly. And the White House has been very concerned. They'd sort of sent people over, but it still wasn't running very quickly. So I recruited 2 technologists to come with me and kind of take a look at it. And it would be the model for what we now call discovery sprints in our world, probably in many of your worlds as well. So we met with the guy who was leading this up, a senior official at the VA, our very first day. And first of all, he thanks us for coming because he says it's wonderful that the White House has sent somebody to confirm that everything is fine now. And we find out later that the reason everything is fine now is that latency has been defined as 2 minutes or more. So if you, as a processor of these benefits applications, clicks on a link in on your screen, and you only have to wait 1 minute and 59 seconds for the next screen to load, you are not to report latency. So this leader has clearly figured out ways to define problems away. But the next thing that happens is that we're asking him a bunch of questions about how VBMS, Veterans Benefit Management System, was designed. Why does it do X over Y? Why does it, why did you choose this instead of that? And he keeps saying, oh, that wasn't our call. I don't know about that. You'll have to ask the program people. You'll have to ask the procurement people. And I finally sort of push him on it, like, why aren't you willing to sort of weigh in on these things? And he says, I've spent my career teaching my people not to have an opinion on the business requirements. If they want us to build a concrete boat, we'll build a concrete boat.
And can you explain what a concrete boat means to folks?
Yeah, basically, it's sort of a metaphor for the way we tend to, in more traditional legacy contexts, build technology in government, which is we spend many years gathering often thousands of requirements. I think the last RFP that I looked at in California was 6,700 requirements. And they sort of all get through, everybody gets to add, nobody gets to subtract, nobody really gets to prioritize. They all get thrown in one big bucket. And because there's just so much there that this system is supposed to do, without any clarity about what's important and how you would actually meet the needs of the users, you end up with something that's so weighed down with these requirements and expectations that it is like a concrete boat. When it's supposed to float, it sort of sinks instead, which is, of course, what you've seen happen with many government technology projects. Is there's many, many, many years and often hundreds of millions of dollars in getting them built. And when they launch, they sort of go, doo, 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 much like healthcare.gov famously. So, this moment of hearing that actually that is often intentional was just heartbreaking for me. I kind of felt punched in the gut because, of course, the impact in the real world of that acceptance of a process that ends up in a concrete boat and the acceptance of this technology leader's role in that meant that veterans weren't getting their benefits. And at the time, I think there were 18 veterans a day that were committing suicide, often without those benefits. So I was very emotionally, upset by this, and also wanted to recognize that this senior leader at the VA was, in some sense, speaking the truth, that we had set up a system in which nobody is really supposed to take responsibility for the thing working. Everyone is supposed to do their part in adding their requirements and hiring a contractor and checking off all the boxes. But there's never a box. There's never a requirement for the thing is supposed to work for people. And so we have a systemic problem. Certainly, there's also a leadership problem. And I want to make sure we talk on this hour about folks who make very different choices from this senior leader at the VA and do take responsibility, even when the system isn't set up to do so. But we have a systemic problem that is creating these conditions.
Yep. And so there's a lot to this story, because basically, this 2-minute idea is fascinating. From the idea we are what we measure. So we're measuring 2 minutes and that's what we get. And we're measuring adhering to the process and that's what we get. And so really this story is a story of incentives and what incentives are around people. So tell us how your team broke through, how it was finally broken through to make some changes within the veterans application flow.
Yeah, I don't talk about that much in the book, but and it's a very small example. I think it speaks to some other ways in which we've been able to get through. But truthfully, when he says, I've taught my people not to have an opinion on the business requirements, well, we then went on the road for 2 weeks and talked to a lot of his people who worked for the VA, people who worked for the contractors who worked for the VA. And actually, all of them did have opinions about the business requirements, but they were, and they had a lot of good ideas. Not everybody had exactly the right idea because they're stuck in their one little spot and they can't see the whole system. There's sort of no one's job to pull back and look at the whole thing. But enough people, well, pretty much everybody cared very much about getting it fixed. And enough people had the right ideas that just needed to be surfaced and brought back up the chain to be heard by folks in the sort of the middle and more senior levels, that we were able to get a lot of things moving a lot more quickly. And that speaks to sort of this other metaphor that, other than concrete boats, that I think operates in government all the time, which is this idea of a waterfall, that people sort of closer to the ground actually can see what's going on. but they are told simply to do what the person above them in the hierarchy tells them to do. And the news of how that might play out on the isn't always welcome. We could talk about how I learned about that at the EDD, but essentially with those folks at the VA, we just had permission to go talk to folks that were closer to the actual work and bring their ideas back up the chain and get them some air. I don't think we had a single original idea in that whole discovery sprint.
Yeah. This kind of goes back to this idea that, the strategy and policy is great, but if we're not looking at the small details of life, of how things actually land, that it's not going to be successful in market. And I think one of the examples you gave was actually like looking at how somebody was applying within, watching them apply, which in behavioral science, we call this behavioral diagnosis, where we're actually like going through every step of the process to see what people do and then redesigning the environment to make it work for them. And so I think that kind of hammer and struck by one of the things you did was show the video of somebody going through this flow to policymakers. And then it's really hard to ignore that people are struggling. And in this particular case, it was a mobile versus a non-mobile site and very difficult to operate on something, if there's high latency and it's not built for you.
Yeah, there's this famous veteran that a colleague of mine went out and had, who had been trying to apply for veterans healthcare for, I think it was 6 or 7 years. And it's just worth explaining, I think, why he couldn't apply. So this was actually a front end system, not the back end. The VBMS thing was a back end system that we were looking at. But separately, the team that followed on after that engagement that helped start USDS, a team sort of grounded at the VA, started looking at how people would apply and tried applying. It's sort of basic first thing of user research is try the thing yourself. But importantly, and actually this may have to do, I didn't put this in the book, this may have to do a little bit with how hard it is to work in government. Some of our fellows, our presidential innovation fellows that year who were assigned for the VA didn't get their own laptops. They didn't get assigned a laptop for over 6 months. So they were using their own laptops. Now, of course, good user research would use, a mobile phone, different kinds of laptops with different kinds of internet connections anyway. But it turns out if you tried to apply for veterans healthcare on pretty much any computer outside the walls of the VA, this form would not load. And it turns out that in the requirements for that particular application was written that it needed to work on a very specific and outdated combination of Internet Explorer and Adobe Reader. And if you had anything other than those two exact versions of those programs installed, you just got these error messages, which asked you to do a bunch of technical things that, like, in theory you could do, but like nobody knew how to do. So essentially, when this veteran, Dominic, who they interviewed, had been calling in and saying, this doesn't work, they'd say, there must be something wrong with you. It works fine. Because it did inside the building. It worked just fine. And it wasn't until they recorded him talking about his past experience, trying to load it up again and being just very articulate and sort of funny and charming, as well as, damning, I think, and showed this video of Dominic talking about how it felt like he was back in Iraq and there were sort of spikes in IEDs in this whole process, and showed this to the Deputy Secretary of the VA, that someone finally said, okay, there is actually something wrong, despite the fact that all the paperwork says that this application form works just fine.
Yeah. This is a tip for any user researcher out there. So basically in behavioral science, we do a lot of like large scale studies. So we do like 1,000 people and we'll split them by 5 conditions. And we put up a slide that says, see, this condition works. And it turns out that's not that convincing. The real thing that's convincing is actually having one person go through the experience and show that it works, because we all kind of have this empathy. Paul Bloom says this is the identifiable victim effect. This is the idea that we're more moved by seeing one person than seeing a lot of statistics. And so when we're trying to convince people to do something, the idea of having these statistics of saying, well, this is not working, may be less impactful than actually just showing that. And I think that's really what Jen's team has been very good at, is the element of persuasion to get people, to listen and pay attention. Let's move. I was one of my favorite stories was the GPS story of basically how do you get data from satellites to the ground. Obviously, a very complicated thing, but it went and took a much longer time than it had to, and I don't know if it didn't even launch in the way that it was supposed to because of some of the intricacies of how the contract was set up and the bidding process. So, can you talk a little bit about that?
So this is a team that after I'd left and helped start USDS, this team was sent to Raytheon, it's a contractor for the Air Force in Colorado, because this team working on the software essentially that was supposed to run the new satellites that enable GPS. They'd been working on it for quite a long time. It was stuck. It had gone, I mean, I don't remember the stats, it's in the book, but like literally billions of dollars over budget. And they just couldn't move forward. And one of the major things that a colleague of mine found out is that while there's a very simple, basic, sort of lightweight protocol that would enable you to get the data from the satellites down to the ground station, they weren't allowed to use that alone. So it was sort of this protocol called UDP was at the front end and the back end. And in the middle, they'd inserted what essentially is like the software equivalent of a giant Rube Goldberg machine called an enterprise service bus, something that was, they're still around mostly, in government and in sort of corporate applications. They were very popular sort of in the 90s. And it's like, putting the data in a quick way and then having it go through this crazy thing and then trying to get back out the other end. It was constantly timing out. And he's like, why don't you just remove this? And they say, we can't. It's a requirement in the contract that we signed with the Air Force. The Air Force requires us to use this, and we're in violation if we don't use it. So my friend and colleague, Matthew Weaver, decides to go figure out why this is the case, because it's obviously incredibly destructive. And he traces it back to something called the Air Force Enterprise Architecture, which derives from the Department of Defense Enterprise Architecture, which derives from something called the Federal Enterprise Architecture, which was created by the CIO Council, also sort of in the late 90s, at the bequest of Congress, that said, you need to do a better job coordinating amongst all the agencies. You need sort of an architecture across all of government that will allow for interoperability. And the people at the Air Force believe that this is literally required. But if you go back and look at the Federal Enterprise Architecture, it talks about interoperability generally, and it uses ESB, Enterprise Service Bus, as an example of how one might achieve interoperability. But there is nowhere in any of these documents, at least at the higher level, that says thou must use an enterprise service bus. But essentially, we have this process of sort of derivative documents, ongoing sort of through the layers of a hierarchy, where at each level that it sort of descends from, say, Congress and the White House down to a team at Raytheon working for the Air Force, it's been written in such that it sounds more and more required at each subsequent level, to the point that, it really was a requirement in that contract. So they're not wrong, but somewhere along the way, it has become wrong. And part of the reason for that is that, if you don't know what an enterprise service bus is, and it just looks like it's sort of something that the people above said that you should do, you're generally going to be, speaking to your point, Kristen, of incentives. Your incentive is that it's better to be safe than sorry, and make it a requirement. And that's just sort of happened through the course of many small decisions by many different people writing different documents in government. Now, particularly people who probably don't actually know what any of this technology means. And that's part of the problem. But this sort of flipping of Congress's intent, right, at the top, what they wanted was better government technology. what they got was like in an interminable delay and like billions of dollars of cost overrun. And yes, you are correct. Like we did end up putting the new satellites up in space, but in this particular area, they shipped back up to space with the old software because they never could make it work.
Oh,
It's not like we don't have GPS, but we don't have the greater I guess granularity of location that we could have had, for instance. So they got exactly the opposite of what they wanted. And the sort of lesson that I derived from that, and you can see it in many other patterns as well, is that the culture has essentially eaten the policy. The policy wanted X, and what they got was, negative X. I'm not sure. It's more than just Y, right? And there's, in a certain sense, nothing wrong with the policy as written. What is going on there has 100% to do with the culture of government interpreting things in the most rigid, sort of maximalist possible way. And when you do that, time after time after time through a very large and complex organization where it's really easy for the step below not to really understand the meaning of the people above and just simply do what the words say rather than what they meant, you're going to have that happen over and over again. And you're going to end up with, negative X instead of X by the time it hits the ground.
Yeah, totally. I would say also that I wouldn't let other industries off the hook. There's a nice example in behavioral sciences of, and Thaler gives this, which is basically when 401k matching launched, in the forms, in the small gray text, I think it was even asterisk, it says, a match could be 3%. And so the government didn't say what a match had to be. It was up to the HR teams. Every employer could figure it out. You could have 1%, you could have 5%. The idea was it is now a policy that enables this. And lo and behold, a majority, if not almost all, of the employers went with 3%. Like paying attention to this kind of what we say is an implicit default. Another story is in the health field, where we basically are trying to decrease prescriptions of opioids, and yet time and again, doctors are prescribing what is the default in the back end healthcare system. And so if it says 10, they're going to prescribe 10. If it says 12, they're going to prescribe 12. And so we're basically taking cues from our environment and then coding those as what we actually have to do. And so maybe we can move then to, and there's lots of other stories and maybe we'll come back to them, but I think at this point it's like, well then, so what do we do? How do we fix this? And Carl in the chat asked a question that maybe could even tee this up, which is, is it really the skill set of the workers in there that needs to change in order to, or the roles that need to change in order to get improvement? And I think this is almost a tee up for the his questions around, do we just need people to write better RFPs? Because if we write better RFPs, then the vendor could go and execute. And so Jen, if you want to, it's a large complex question, which is how would we change the people, and also like what do we think about these RFPs and the vendors?
Yeah, so it is a large, complex question. I mean, yes, I think you could write RFPs, and I think there's many examples of better RFPs in government. But I think the wrong conclusion there is we just need better requirements. I think we need a completely different framework. I mean, I don't know that you're going to entirely get rid of requirements, but requirements being sort of the driving force is sort of the problem. And I say in the book, it's not that they got the wrong requirements, it's that they were specifying those requirements at all. And that there's, as they say, there will never be a requirement that simply says the thing needs to work. It needs to work for the people who are going to use it, right? That's just not how you do requirements. They're much more specific than that. And so the language of, what do you understand the user needs and can you meet the user needs is something we borrowed from our friends in the UK. I know the behavioral field also has lots of roots in the UK. Lots of friends over in the UK. So that and being able to contract with companies to help out on a much more flexible framework that's more about user needs is part of it, but it's certainly not going to be all of it. And even getting to that will require some of the other changes implied by the question. I think it's really important to understand that, and this is true in that case and many, many others, is it the skill sets? Yes. The people who make these decisions in government, so in many cases, the worst outcomes come from the best public servants making the most diligent and thorough decisions and doing the most diligent and thorough jobs they possibly could. So it's almost always these really, really good intentions. And it is, as you say, structural and systemic, not like, it's really hard and I think unfair often to point the finger at the very, very thorough, detail-oriented public servant who ended up writing this in as a requirement. I mean, they are trying to do their job as best as they possibly can. One of the structural issues is that these, I will call them digital competencies, though of course, like behavioral science and design and user research are all part of that for me. That is not considered a core competency of government. If you look at the number of people who touch any given procurement, you're going to see a lot of lawyers, a lot of consultants, a lot of requirements gatherers who, are just putting in boxes, enormous number of procurement professionals. And you're going to see almost nobody who actually does the work of creating these systems, almost nobody with what I would call broadly defined digital skills, because we have defined that away in much the way that we've defined Kevin away by saying all of that stuff is simply something we buy from a contractor, but not something that belongs inside the halls of government. So that is a fundamental change in framework about what we believe government is supposed to do and what public servants are charged with doing. That's going to have to change so that they're people who actually understand how they're going to build the system. Not that you're not going to use contractors, but that there's somebody inside who actually has that knowledge to say, this is, an ESP does not belong in here.
Yeah. Because Jen, is it okay if I project Get Cal Fresh?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Get Cal Fresh, is that the website?
Yes.
Okay, great. Because I think this just blew my mind when Jen said, I think I have a fair bit of skepticism, like many folks, like, can the government build internally these websites that could help us, right? Is that even possible? Because what we have in our heads for government is a bunch of forms and a bunch of paperwork. And so there's a real question is like, if we're going to have more internal capability, like what does this actually look like? And let me just share my screen. Like this does not look like a government website.
Yeah.
This just has zero. I would never have guessed this is a government website. And so, Jen's team, basically, SNAP has over 200 questions, and California's rate of application was very low. It's gotten higher. It's not as high as it could be, but it's gotten much higher. And some of the reason is because now people go through this site versus the 200 plus questions that SNAP was asking. So Jen, maybe give a little bit of color on this site. And then if folks want to think about in about 5 to 10 minutes, we'll transition to having questions from the audience. So think about your questions. And then while Jen kind of explains the process for this site or gives us an overview.
So this is the work of a team at Code for America. I haven't been at Code for America for 3 years, but this started, almost 10 now. The interesting context is that we used to run this fellowship program, and we had people come in for a year, and then they'd move off. And one guy, Jake Solomon, had been assigned to work with the city and county of San Francisco for a year with a couple other colleagues. And, in a year, they'd done a lot of interesting things. They helped the HSA, the Human Services Agency there, learn how to text their clients. That was one of the big problems, is like, it's very hard to communicate with low-income people exclusively through email and like phone calls. But at the end of the year, he was truly upset that they hadn't been able to do more, and especially relative to the size of the problem. And he had started spending a lot of time at 1135 Mission Street, which is right around the corner from our office, where people would come into the office and be applying. And this is where, I particularly, because it was the first time we'd had a fellowship in San Francisco, I got to spend a lot of time sort of watching what they were doing. They would, go over, and as people were waiting in line, say, have you considered applying online? Would you be so kind as to let me watch you use this application? And they learned so much from just that one question over and over and over again. And, one of the problems was that, yes, that form I should clarify, there were actually 3 different applications in the state of California. It doesn't matter that much, but in San Francisco, we used something called My Benefits CalWin. It had 212 questions. Some of them were things like, have you, since April 10th, 1996, ever traded your SNAP benefits for guns, ammunition, or drugs? Why do you need that question? Is that really necessary?
Yeah.
What is that saying to the user about who you think they are, right? There were questions at the end that, important if you're trying to get people to apply for this, that some of your users are going to be undocumented immigrants into our country. They are absolutely allowed to benefit from SNAP, but they're not allowed to vote. And if you put at the end of this application a form asking them to sign up, to register to vote, and that has all this language about you must be a citizen, it's very confusing, and you get huge abandonment rates right at the end for something that, of course, is incredibly well-intentioned, right? You want SNAP users to register to vote, but what you've unintentionally done is driven away all of anybody who is afraid of, maybe they even have a member of their family who's undocumented. They're going to abandon it. So you had all these problems with this form. And the team ended their fellowship year and said, I'm not leaving, I'm going to keep working on this, and designed this it was much simpler back then. You're seeing the more mature version. Designed the simplest, lightest weight form that you could possibly imagine. And they had this wonderful stunt where they had earned a lot of credibility and trust with the man who ran SNAP for San Francisco. And they asked for a meeting, and they walked in, and they had loaded up something called Get Cal Fresh on their phone. And they handed it to him, and they said, just fill this out: name, email address, phone number. I can't remember, like, one other question, and hit submit. And they listened for the sound of the fax machine, which started whirring, and it pushed out a valid application for SNAP benefits for that director. And it said, this is how easy it could be. Of course, they didn't intend actually to continue to fax those things, and they didn't have to. But they sort of showed in that moment, even though that wasn't a sustainable way of doing it, they massively moved the Overton window from this 212 question form that didn't work on a mobile and scared most users off to this is how simple it could be. And the screenshot that you showed, Kristen, is sort of what that evolved into, which is, asks more questions, is a more complete application, but has so much less of that friction in there that keeps people who need SNAP from getting it.
Yeah, that's great. And if folks on the call haven't read, there's this book called Subtract by Letty Kaus. And the idea here is basically sometimes things get better when you take them away. And yet our intuition is just not this. So if we want to improve something, we tend to just add more and more things. We think about innovation as adding a new feature, a new product versus taking it away. And I think that's maybe some of the insight with the, changing these forms is the hardest thing for us to do as humans seems to be subtract things.
Can I add to that, Kristen, before we move on? I think an important lesson that I try to share with particularly people who work in government is we are very focused on, the idea of streamlining a form has become very, very popular. What can we take out? What we need to remember is sometimes that form does not need to exist at all. And there's nothing better than actually just eliminating it. The best example of that is the records clearance program that is also another Code for America story. We have many states, including California, that decriminalized marijuana. So when it's no longer a crime, you're left with, in case of California, hundreds of thousands of people who have a former felony conviction on their record for something that's no longer a crime, and they should not have to live under the burden of a felony conviction. But getting that conviction taken off their record, again, just studying the process in the same way that the Get CalFresh team studied how people had to apply, they couldn't just, watch folks apply online and then wait for the phone call and get the benefit. In getting your record cleared, it was a year, almost a year-long process of finding the right form, gathering the right documents from various police departments and courthouses, filling out an incredibly complicated form, filing it with different places, waiting to hear back, paying a fee, going to the court. I mean, this was just a completely unsustainable paperwork and showing up in person process that kept people from getting through it almost entirely. I mean, at the end of the first year that this law got into effect in San Francisco, 23 people had started the process. None of them had gotten through it. So at that point, you had almost zero impact from a law that was, designed to impact millions of people. And we ourselves spent, I think 2.5 years just trying to reduce the friction in that system before we came to the conclusion that there was no point. You could simply say, why are people petitioning for this at all? They don't have to petition to get the felony on their record. That happens automatically. If it happens automatically to put it on, it should happen automatically to take it off. And that the correct solution is not like, make it a little bit easier, get more, pro bono lawyers, just none of that is actually all that helpful to a problem like this. In the end of the day, a felony record is a record, is a field in a database. And it's not that hard to simply find all the people who have that felony record that can be expunged and change those records. We haven't, to be clear, gotten all the way there. We don't just find them and change them. What we do is find them, put them all on one big petition, still have them go through a little bit of a process, and then have that data go back and then be changed. But it is still now at least not putting any burden on the user, still putting probably more burden than it needs to on the bureaucracy, but still so much less than having everything essentially be a court case. So yeah. Don't just subtract, you can also zero.
Yeah, that's great. And that's kind of the essence of behavioral science when we think about, we don't want people to do anything. We tend to take the path of least resistance, and that is nothing, doing nothing. Doing the same things we did yesterday and the same things we did the day before. And so in order to get change to happen, we have to really decrease the amount of effort. And obviously that the best is just having no effort at all. I have a few more questions, but we will take one from the chat. So Jessica asked if you could recommend one action to any government on how to start rethinking some of their digital programs, digital applications. What would it be?
The first thing is, if you haven't done it already, try to use every service that you are responsible for and not from your work computer. Try to go through it from end to end, do it on a mobile phone. And have your other team members do it. I know that's very, very basic, but so often we find that hasn't happened.
Yeah, I would emphasize this even for non-government, for companies. We worked with a healthcare company, and the goal was to increase virtual mental health care or access. And when we went through the whole flow, it was there's no button for it. And we were like, what? And so the idea of it in theory, is so appealing, and people put it on a slide and say, we're going to do good. And we have, the vendor who's ready, and we have it on the site somewhere. But the normal flow, the 80% flow that most people go through, the button was actually missing. So we could all use kind of a refresh of just doing the step-by-step process and going through the flow to see what actually happens. Great. And then Carl had a follow-up question on what's your opinion on the quality of program evaluation in the US government? So who usually does it? His kind of background is that it could be that the people who are administering the program are doing the evaluation. And is that correct? That seems like a conflict of interest.
Yeah, honestly, it's not something I'm deeply steeped in. I do think that I think the biggest problem really is what are we actually evaluating these programs on? And that varies widely. If you look at, for instance, benefits, which is, not the sum total of what I'm talking about here, Participation rates are sort of only part of the evaluation. So much of benefit delivery in the US, the program evaluation that really matters is about essentially what we think of as fraud. I mean, it's popularly known as fraud, and say improper payments or overpayments often includes things where, in fact, what we've done is confused the user so they don't actually know what that they have, not filed a form that they need to, and then that gets bucketed under fraud, for instance. And it makes the agency so oversensitive to fraud in many cases. Also, just the way that the press sort of goes at these agencies on any little bit of fraud. Obviously, we had much worse fraud during the pandemic for reasons we could talk about. But there are very often multiple evaluations going on at the same time. And speaking to this sort of issue of behavior, which ones are people really going to pay attention to? I saw this like very, very clearly when I was working at the Employment Development Department of California over the pandemic, trying to clear a backlog of claims that turned out to be about 1.3 million claims that were sort of stuck. And you had two competing goals at that time. One was, how do you get 1.3 million people who applied for their unemployment benefits 4 months ago, have run out of their savings and desperately need that benefit, their money, and how to reduce fraud? And there are lots and lots of incentives for that agency to focus on reducing the fraud, not, or at least to be seen as reducing the fraud, and to make sure they do whatever they can not to have that fraud pinned on them, essentially. They are far more incented to do that than they are actually to get that 1.3 million out the door. And, we really have to sort of at the end decide, if we're evaluating a program, what are we actually evaluating it on? And, how do we enable that agency to deliver on that? I think you probably know more than I do, reading the question, about program managers responsible for evaluating their own programs. So I will admit to not being the expert there.
I think though that the insight here is very nice. So in the example that Jen is talking about, basically there was, a decision that had to be have of where to focus people's time, and there's a small percentage of fraud going on and a large percentage of people who are missing their benefits. And I think that is kind of maybe one of the takeaways, or at least that I had from the book, is that at some level there isn't a product manager in order to say what's important. And sometimes there's an 80-20 rule to say, look, we're going to have to trade off this fraud, and they're able to go to bat for it. And kind of take some level of risk, and know that they still have some job security. And product managers are very good at doing that. Project managers are good at managing process, and maybe kind of to this, like, we are what we measure idea, really about following process here. We're gonna pick another. So Nellie asked about the EDD and kind of what happened. I would say in COVID, if there's anything you want to add there about insights from processing those applications. I know that is a big story, so I'll let you if there is anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, when I went to help out at the EDD, I felt like I'd kind of seen it all in a certain sense, and it was a good a reminder for me that you're always still learning, right? I'm like, I know what this is going to look like. But one of the big learning moments for me that I think speaks to Nellie's question was we'd gone in and we started to look at the technology that was supposed to be delivering these unemployment benefits. And first of all, people think there's a system. There's not a system, especially in this case and in many other cases. There's many fragmented systems that you can pretty much track back sort of decade by decade. Starting often it starts in like the 1980s, when they digitize these processes, and then you get sort of the next, the next era, you see sort of changes in the technology, and then in the 2000s, they put the thing online. And these systems don't work very well together. They haven't ever gone back and said, how would we design this to actually work together? They've just sort of added a layer on top. And let them try to communicate with each other. And that's where a lot of the fragility and complexity comes in. But my colleague Marina was working with claims processors, trying to figure out where our leverage points were to get these 1.3 million claims cleared. And one of these claims processors kept saying to her, I'm not quite sure the answer to your question. I'm still new here. I'm the new guy. I'm still learning. And she finally said to him, well, how long have you been here? And he said, well, I've only been here for 17 years. The folks who really know how this works have been here for 25 years or more. And that when she brought that anecdote back to me, we couldn't let it go, because we realized that if you think about the policy and process and regulation and law that governs unemployment insurance, it dates back to the 1935 Social Security Act. There have been almost 90 years of policy, process, regulation, procedure changes that have happened since that date. And so those layers, archaeological layers of technology, actually map, at least starting in the 80s, to archaeological layers of policy change and then on that process change, et cetera. And that's why it's complex, right? And if you want to talk about a fragile system that doesn't scale, one in which it takes 25 years to learn it, and you need those people at greater amounts in a crisis, that simply won't scale. And so I think it was the best illustration I'd ever seen after sort of 12 years of working in this field, that we're not really going to be able to fix these things at the tech level until we address that policy and process level. And so later in the book, I talk about public servants who push back and say, we actually cannot deliver this service if we don't simplify the policy and process that you're telling us we need to implement in this technology. And that, to me, ultimately is the answer to this, is much like it's the opposite of the leader at the VA saying, I'll just build the concrete boat because that's what you've told me to do. The real answer is saying, no, we're not going to do that. We've got to simplify the policy and process that attends this whole system in order to make technology systems that will, as we say, make sense to a person.
Yeah, that's great. You also had another quote. This is when I forget exactly, is when you're building another requirement or adding another field, you have to think about a woman actually trying to fill it out while managing a toddler with her other hand. And so that idea seems kind of disconnected from policy, that people are making the ideal policy that would, yes, in a perfect world, be the thing to execute on, but forgetting kind of the human element of how it actually comes alive.
That anecdote came from Rachel Edelman, who was watching parents fill out forms about like school vaccination in Kansas City, and she's just watching these parentless moms like try to fill this out, yeah, with dirty hands and all this stuff, and she's like, no more fields on this form, please.
Yeah. That's actually a joke. Kind of our team says. I think it did come from Dan Ariely, where he's like, look, many people want their kids to grow up to be a doctor or a lawyer. As behavioral scientists, we want them to grow up to be a form designer, because right, this is what power is. It's like you have so much power if you're designing the form that, and maybe hopefully there's no forms, but you have so much power if you're designing the form. So we have about 4 minutes left. I would say, this is kind of a promo, I would read the book. I really enjoyed the very small details of it. From the we measure to the rewards and incentive system to the small bits of friction that are embedded. And I think the hope and change here is that, and this is, I'm such a cult member in behavioral science, but by doing these behavioral diagnosis and understanding the flows that people go through, we can actually dramatically simplify things. And that, there is some process by which we can get to a simpler version of some of these forms and processes. Jen, do you want to end on an uplifting note, or how to make sense of all the friction that we've just talked about?
Sure. I mean, I guess what I'd end on is that I think in the way the hero of the book is a career civil servant named Yadira Sanchez, and I have had the pleasure of becoming friends with her through the course of writing this and now promoting the book. It's working at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services is her very first job. She's been there 25 years. And she's the one who, of all the research I did for this book, best exemplified this spirit of challenging the people above her and around her to simplify things to make sense for a person. And the reason she does it so well in the end is, well, she's smart as a tack and totally fearless, but like, she just cares so deeply about improving the medical care that people get in our public healthcare systems. And of course, when we change our public healthcare systems, it drives the rest of our healthcare. And she's just completely passionately dedicated to this. And, you know, at the end, I tell several stories of her sort of challenging essentially requirements that are coming down and saying it's that won't work because it won't make sense to a person. And at the end, this doesn't have to do with the form, but she moves on to her one of her more recent projects, where she's been asked by Congress to do these data extracts of pharmaceutical data for the ecosystem to be able to use. As sort of this classic thing in healthcare where all this data gets handed out. And she looks at it and she says, doing quarterly extracts of this data is going to take 9 months for us to package up and get out because of all of the regulations that you burdened us on that. And it won't be very timely or helpful. It's only a snapshot of the data at any given moment. We could just make an API and it'll be a little more costly up front, but far cheaper to operate in the long run and just better for everyone. And she goes to the ecosystem and explains this, and they all say, great. And that's what she does. And she literally is not following the letter of the law. She is not doing exactly what Congress told her to do. It's not just at a regulatory level. She's not just telling someone in the middle of this whole process, I'm sorry. She's literally saying to Congress, you're wrong, I'm right, I'm going to do it the right way. And that is a level of boldness that I would love to see in every public servant and everybody who's designing systems that have to make sense to people. And it's telling to me that the boldest person I met is not someone who just jumped in from sort of the tech sector, but a career civil servant who cares first and foremost about serving people.
That's great. Wonderful, wonderful way to wrap. So I think we posted 2 things in the chat numerous times. So if you haven't caught it, you're just not paying attention, which is Jen's book. And then if you guys want to get more involved in Rational Labs, the easiest way to do that is Bootcamp or our membership. And we host lots of these events that we think are very exciting and enlightening. And for sure this one was. So thank you, Jen. Really grateful and feel very lucky to get your time.
I'm really enjoyed this, and I feel honored to be with you all. Thanks so much, Kristen.
Thank you, Jen.